So we're just starting this new series on converting the church, is what we're calling it. If you're new with us, like at New Life, we make fully reproducible followers of Jesus in the everyday stuff of life. That's what we do together, and we define a follower of Jesus as someone who has an ever increasing awareness to the presence and the lordship of Jesus in the everyday stuff of life. And so we're going to be camping out in Matthew chapter 23. If you got a Bible, I want to encourage you to go there. And we're going to be just really picking that thing apart over the next several weeks. So it's Valentine's Day this week. It also begins a season in the church calendar that you may have heard of before called Lent. And maybe some of you grew up doing Lent, and really Lent mostly means to you we're going to eat a lot of fish, specifically Fridays, right? Yeah, I can see some of you nodding your head. And so Lent actually it's not necessarily a biblical idea. It's more of a church tradition thing, but there's some really neat things about it. Essentially, that the main purpose of Lent and the thinking behind it was this idea that you kind of create your own wilderness. So within the scriptures, there's this idea that you do have times and seasons of wilderness in your life that are kind of difficult to navigate, and you're learning how to trust God through those difficult times. And Lent, the concept was is that you would actually enter into a season of fasting or kind of doing without something to create a wilderness season for yourself. And historically, in church tradition, it's a time of really letting the Spirit reveal to you some areas of sin in your life. Um, and the Bible really defines sin as not just like external behavioral things, but really like internal stuff. So as we're kind of leaning into that season together, I wanted us to read some of Jesus's most intense teaching to some of the most religious people in the scriptures. And the reason we're calling this converting the church is because there's just some of the same dangers that existed in Jesus's time still exist now with us. And so we just got to be aware of these things. So before we kind of jump in, we need to kind of do a little bit of a history lesson here. You guys game for that? Yeah? Okay, all right. So in Jesus's time, there were four kind of main folks, the categories of people. This is not completely exhaustive, but I just want to give you a sense of like what was happening. And I promise there's a reason for this, okay? So I promise like this is not just like, hey, this happened 2,000 years ago. Enjoy the Super Bowl, all right? So just bear with me, okay? I think Jesus actually, he's actually going to teach us how these groups of people are still kind of exist. So the first one was the zealots. They basically had two rules: keep your mind sharp and your sword sharp. Uh, these were Jewish people in Jesus's time. They were living through a very difficult political situation in Israel, and the Roman government had taken over, and they taxed people to the point of starvation in some ways. It was the tax. You guys think our taxes are high, if you do. These were, sometimes 40, 50% of your earnings. It just was an incredible amount of taxation. And there was not like, this wasn't like high tax, free healthcare kind of thing. Okay, this was like high tax and we'll take your tax and build a road in another country, right? So anyways, these guys were zealots, and they basically get this idea from the scriptures. There's a story in Exodus about this guy named Phineas, and you guys may or may not remember this, but God delivers his people from Egypt. They get into the wilderness. Moses goes up onto the mountain, and the people are like, "We don't know what happened to that guy. He's like stuck up there in the cloud. Maybe he's not coming back." Have you guys considered that maybe we should make an idol and worship that? It's so fun. And so I know the Bible's great. So they gathered together all the gold that they took from Egypt, they melted all down, and boom, out comes a calf, just magically. And they start worshiping this calf. Moses comes down the mountain. He's like, "What in the world's going on?" He breaks the tablets, and then he tells the people that we have committed a grave sin against God. Anybody that went and worshiped this, you're going to have to deal with these people. So this guy named Phineas takes his sword and kills a bunch of people. Did you guys? Then so this is actually this idea of where we get this zealous idea for the Lord. And so people that were zealots believed that they needed to actually physically overthrow this empire, and that at any chance they were going to kind of rise up and do this. Now, you guys still with me? Everybody? Okay, good. Here we go. Yeah. So we're really getting into it. So in between our testaments, the Old and the New Testament, there's a lot of stuff that happened. One of those things was called the Maccabean Rebellion, which was this group of zealots that rose up against the empire. And actually, our Jewish neighbors still celebrate what happened in that Maccabean Rebellion with Hanukkah. So they lit this menorah. It stayed lit for eight nights, which was like kind of this miraculous thing that happened. And so there was still a group of people that were like, we will overthrow by force these Romans, and the Messiah will lead the charge for that, okay? Then there was these guys called the Essenes. This is a picture of this place called Qumran. And if you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls before, any super Bible nerd people we have out there, this is where those come from. The Essenes were kind of like monks. They believed that the best way to deal with the struggle of the Roman Empire is like, let's just get out of here, right? So they kind of like made a little space and they got out of there, and they just didn't want to have to deal with all the like, how do we compromise? Do we pay taxes? Do we not? So they just like, let's go to the mountains and escape. Okay? So you had that group of people. You also had the Sadducees. They were sad. No, I'm just kidding. They weren't. That's not. Their theology was kind of sad. The Sadducees were folks that the way that they dealt with the Rome stuff was just syncretism. So they kind of just made a theology to sort of match some of the Roman stuff. And they believed that you could kind of compromise and work with the enemy, so to speak, to get stuff done. Yeah? And so this is an overgeneralization, but essentially one of the things about the Sadducees was that their theology kind of pushed away the supernatural, and so they didn't actually believe in the resurrection of the dead anymore. And so we still kind of see this at work in the church now. There's a lot of people that are saying that supernatural things in the Bible didn't actually happen. There's ways to describe those things, but these guys' theology more or less died out after the Second Temple collapse in 70 AD. But the spirit that was there is still kind of around. Then there was the Pharisees. Okay, so Pharisees are like the bad guy of the Bible, right? You guys anybody hear the word Pharisee and it's like just all kinds of positive connotations? Like it's like, oh, Pharisees, yeah, those guys are good. So yeah, they get a little bit of a bad rap, and that's mostly because of Jesus. In fact, it's interesting because Pharisees would not have been like a clear and present danger to most people living in the ancient Near East. So basically what Pharisees were is they believed that they believed in the physical resurrection. They believed in supernatural things. They were actually waiting for the Messiah. And they believed that the way that they could kind of speed up this process is by being super diligent Torah followers. So that's the first 5 books of the Bible. And they they actually took on the holiness practices found in Leviticus for the priesthood. And their vision actually was to extend the holiness practices that God required of the priests to all the homes in Israel. So this was kind of the vision. And these guys were not priests. So this was kind of like a grassroots movement. The Sadducees were the people who had most of the power in the time. The Pharisees didn't really have political power, but they had like a lot of clout among the people because they were really devoted. And so I think we need to know about these things because sometimes it's easy for us to read into the text and see them as sort of like a clear antagonist to the story of Jesus. But Jesus identifies them as not good, but it wasn't immediately clear to the people why. And so a lot of times we kind of see them, we think, these specific things about them. So this is what Jesus taught about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And I think that what I really want to show us over the next several weeks is why this is important. Jesus said to his disciples, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, you guys are much smarter than the disciples because you know right away he's not talking about bread, but the disciples thought he was. They're like, we should probably not eat the bread of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They were not smart guys. He had to explain things a lot. And so there's this idea that Jesus is saying that there's some kind of like, you guys know how yeast works, right? You get it in the bread a little bit, and then you just like leave it alone for a little bit. And you come back and it's all puffy and weird. And this is how Jesus was saying, like, there's something that like gets into things, and it like letting it fester, it's gonna like get into everything. And Jesus, I think, was not just telling his disciples to watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees, but he was giving a principle to all of his disciples through all time, which is that these specific corruptions tend to get into the church and kind of mess with stuff. And so Jesus is identifying the Pharisees and the Sadducees as potential problems in theology. And I just want to say, like, I don't think in our church we have as much Sadducee issues, even though we try to talk about those things as much as we can. And I try to my best to explain that Christian theology doesn't just match whatever we think should be right. It has to offend our sensibilities. And I think most of us are on board with that kind of thinking. My concern is that if we're not careful, we can fall into the yeast of the Pharisees. And so I think Dallas Willard observed wisely when he said, how many are radically and permanently repelled by Christians who are unfeeling, stiff, unapproachable, boringly lifeless, and dissatisfied. It's a good list. Yet such Christians are everywhere. And this is the key. Spirituality, wrongly understood or pursued, is a major source of human misery and rebellion against God. It's the interesting thing about the Pharisees. They didn't think of themselves as the enemy. They saw themselves as very devout. But they were searching the scriptures to try to understand eternal life, and they were looking at the way, the truth, and the life, and they couldn't see it. This is a danger here. So if you got your Bibles, we're going to be looking at Matthew 23. And this is some of Jesus' harshest teaching. But Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples. The scribes and the Pharisees are seated in the chair of Moses, or the seat of Moses. Therefore, do whatever they tell you and observe it, but don't do what they do, because they don't practice what they teach. They tie up heavy loads that are hard to carry, and they put them on people's shoulders, and they themselves aren't willing to lift a finger to move them. They do everything to be seen by others. They enlarge their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. Everybody say phylacteries. See, isn't this great? You just come on Sunday and you're getting like vocabulary that you're going to use later. I want to see how many of you can work phylacteries into your Super Bowl conversations later. So let me show you. Does anybody know what a phylactery is? Yeah, all right, let's look at that real quick. So this is a picture of a guy wearing a phylactery. So you see this box on his head. This is like a prayer box. It's called a phylactery. And what was happening is that at this time, people would kind of make their phylacteries more noticeable. A lot of people wore them on their arms, and then they would lengthen their tassels too. So there's like a band that comes out of this phylactery, and it's kind of like a rosary or something. Essentially, it's like a prayer band to remind you of like a this prayer that you're going to pray. Uh, it wasn't the rosary prayer, just to be clear. It was the Shema, which is from Deuteronomy chapter 6. We know it as the great commandment that Jesus gives, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That was Jesus' addition to the Shema. But they would be praying this over and over and over again, trying to understand the scriptures. And so this is another picture. This is kind of the tassels. There's the phylactery on the arm, so you can see, right? Um, and so these guys were really devoted to prayer, and Jesus is saying that actually this is all for show. So back to the passage here. They love the place of honor at banquets, the front seats at synagogues, greetings in the marketplace, to be called rabbi by people. But you are not to be called rabbi because you have one teacher, and all of you are brothers and sisters. Do not call anyone on earth your father, because you have one Father who's in heaven. And you are not to be called instructors either, because you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. It's a pretty intense introduction to some hard teaching, right? So now we get to the first woe. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. And you don't go in, and you don't allow those entering to go in. Woo! What have you guys ever had a situation where somebody is sincere, they really believe what they're talking about, they're just wrong? You know? That ever happened to you with your spouse? I'm just kidding. And you just try to let them know as gently as you can, you know? No, you don't. Not always. Depends on what the stakes are, right? Like if it's like, you know, I think I should take 7 ibuprofen because my brain really hurts. You're like, you know what? That's wrong. You can't take that many. It will hurt you, right? But if it's something stupid, you're just like, I'm gonna let that go. And you just let it go for like 4 or 5 years till it drives you insane. Then you deal with it, right? Usually in the middle of another fight that has nothing to do with that. Anyways, so we'll be doing a talk on marriage and relationships later, but it's hard, right? So for Jesus, the stakes are very high with this. You see, the problem was actually not in the Pharisees' theology. Jesus' theology lines up pretty closely with the Pharisees. The problem is that their theology hadn't made its way into praxis. There was a disconnection between what the Pharisees believed and the way that they lived. And they thought that they could somehow achieve holiness through this kind of ascent, but then they also were really devout in the way that they tried to live as well. But they just couldn't do it. Not the way that they wanted to. See, they were consistent failures. And Jesus here is exposing this. But the problem is that they just keep coming back and sharing these things, that you have to do these things this way. And they created this whole system, this oral tradition that were like protections around the law, right? So what they were trying to do is they just wanted to help people to not offend the Torah. And so in order to do that, they actually created this sort of like hedge around the law. You guys ever do that with your kids? Like you don't want them to drink the the stuff that's like under the sink, so you put the little lock on the under sink thing, right? It's not the rule is not actually I don't want you to open the cabinets. It's like I don't want you to drink what's in there. So as parents, we can have this like hedge of protection that like goes around that. This is kind of what the heart was of the Pharisees. They thought God has given us this law. He wants us to obey this perfectly, and so we're going to kind of build these fences around the laws, right? So, for instance, they really wanted people to observe the Sabbath. And so they created a specific rule about how many steps a person could take during the Sabbath because they didn't want people to work on the Sabbath. And they help people define like what does that look like so that people didn't break that law by accident and somehow be the one that made it so that the Messiah didn't come. Do you see how this kind of starts? And so I want to let you know that I feel like this is still a struggle within Christian reality. So let me just help you understand what's going on here. There are a lot of preachers, their teaching sounds really good. In fact, it sounds like, oh, finally somebody's serious about God. But when you listen to the tone and the posture with which they present the word, it is mostly to scold people and to beat them over the head with these things. And instead of letting the conviction of the Spirit be the one who changes people's hearts, they feel like it's on them to bring conviction. I think that Jesus would say this is false prophecy. This is not the grace of God at work. And so I just want you to be careful about the kind of teachers that you let into what it is that you're listening to. Because there are teachers that still exist that want to lay heavy burdens on people. And this is often what happens is you can see it by the fruit. And so people within these congregations and within churches that these, YouTube preachers have, they're mean. Their theology is good. It sounds biblical-ish, but it's void of all love and grace. And oftentimes what it does is it creates and perpetuates a system that keeps the bad people out of their church, but also keeps the bad people from receiving the goodness of Jesus. See, what happened here is that the Pharisees had become so convinced that Jesus was there as a deceiver that they were preaching against Jesus. And so he says to them, you shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You're out here talking to people about how I'm deceiving people. And you don't want to go in, and you're not even allow those who are entering to go in. We talked about it before, but probably one of the most powerful ways that Jesus illustrates this heart condition of a person is when he tells the story of the two sons. You know it as the story of the prodigal son, right? Because we've heard about this son that Jesus says a man has two sons. One of the youngest sons says, Dad, I wish you were dead. Give me the inheritance that you're going to give when you die. So the guy like sells his land, splits up the inheritance, gives it to the son. The son goes away. He goes to Vegas. He spends it all on prostitutes and gambling. This is a real story from the Bible, guys. He doesn't go to Vegas, but he goes to the ancient Near East Vegas. He runs out of money. Then he ends up working for the circus. shoveling pig poop, and he's really hungry. He's like, I should eat what these pigs are eating. And then he goes home, and the dad's waiting, and the dad is like happy to receive him because he wants to restore him back into the family. So he throws this big party, and then at the party, guess who doesn't come into the party? It's the older brother, the one who was there with his dad the whole time, because he doesn't want the younger brother to come back into the party. One of the main reasons that Jesus was hated by the religious group at the time is that Jesus specifically hung out with tax collectors and sinners. Now, tax collectors and sinners, they weren't like necessarily the people that we would think about as, oh, the sinners, right? The thing is that these were people who understood their reality as sons and daughters of Abraham's. And so they understood, like, we are God's chosen people. And so they took that to mean, like, we can live like hell and there's no consequence. Those are the people that Jesus hung out with. And that was maddening to the people. And then on top of that, you got tax collectors. Now, we already talked about how the Romans taxed people to death. The thing is that the Romans collected a heavy tax, and the tax collectors collected a tip on the side. So the tax collector was in charge of telling you how much tax you would be owed. So they would decide how much tax you owed plus whatever their gratuity was going to be, and then they would collect that from the people. They were not well liked, as one can imagine. And yet Jesus is hanging out with the people that live like hell, and not just people that live like hell, but people that are living like hell because they've already decided, like, whatever we do doesn't have any consequences because we're sons and daughters of Abraham. And it was those people that Jesus actually saw as sheep without a shepherd, because they were completely rejected by the religious world. They were younger sons in the story, but in Jesus' story, it's the older sons that's actually more dangerous. Ironically, in Jesus' thinking, it's actually religious people sometimes that are the furthest away from what Jesus is after. Scary thought. But what I want to ask you today is, like, is there something in you that really wants to keep the bad folks out of the church? And I would just encourage you, like, that is the Pharisee heartbeat. That is not the Jesus way. And can I just, man, for those younger brothers that have been pushed out, whew, I got a story. I was talking to somebody this last week, and he was just like lamenting how his parents had they forced him to go to a Christian Bible college, basically. He didn't want to. He didn't believe in the stuff, and his parents were like, we gotta get this guy fixed, you know? So you guys know this story, right? I mean, maybe not this story, but you know the story, yeah? So they sent him to Bible college. He got expelled for smoking pot, that whole story, right? And he's kind of mad, not just mad at his parents, but like mad at God. Because really what he found in that Christian community was that it was more about conformity than it was about transformation. Now listen, this is not a slight against Christian schools, okay? There's a place for Bible colleges and they should have rules, okay? But what I'm saying is that those are not spaces of transformation necessarily. The church has a unique call in the world to be spaces of transformation and to receive people that are hungry for Jesus. And so they kind of shut the door on him and pushed him out. But now here he is 10 years later, kind of thinking about stuff again. Who is Jesus really? So, man, if that's you, I just want to encourage you that That's the church thing that you had, that hurt that you have from church people. This is not necessarily the heart of Jesus. Um, and you actually may be here today and you're just thinking like, I have got to get my life together to come to Jesus. And I just want to just kind of close with this. This is a quote from Dane Ortland. You don't need to unburden or collect yourself and then come to Jesus. Your very burden is what qualifies you to come. There's no payment that's required. Jesus' promise is, I will give you rest. And his rest it's a gift, not a transaction. So whether you're actively working hard to crowbar your life into smoothness or passively finding yourself weighed down by something outside your control, Jesus Christ's desire is that you find rest and that you come out of the storm. That you come in out of the storm outstrips even your own. This is Jesus' heart for sinners, for people that are just far from him. So guys, my heart is this. Is there something in your heart that mostly gets angry about the stuff that you see in the world, the stuff that you see on TV? Maybe there's going to be like a Super Bowl ad that's going to really tick you off tonight. Do you see people like that, or do you see people the way that Jesus sees them? As not yet Christ followers, as people that are in desperate need of connecting with the real risen Christ. And then what would it look like for us to have a community that's like that? Not a perfect community, not even necessarily an exemplary behavioral community, but a place that is truly the light of the world and hope for people that are really hurting and messed up. Can we really be a space where we can say, you can come here as you are, but you also don't have to stay that way? That we believe that there is a transforming work that happens when you connect to Christ. Would you guys pray with me?